It's going to be 10 months soon since this war began. And while it has fundamentally changed everything from relations in Europe to the mechanics of the oil trade, should Ukraine become a member of NATO has been buried in the fog of this war. For many officials, it is a topic that they will not touch. When pressed, politicians give memorized, sometimes terse, and sometimes even very robotic answers. The question is, when and is Ukraine going to become a full-time NATO member? After all, this was the very question basis which Vladimir Putin launched his special military operation. It's an issue that is so potentially combustible that many NATO allies try to avoid even talking about it. Back in September, when Ukraine requested an accelerated process to join the military alliance, NATO publicly reiterated its open-door policy, but it did not give a concrete answer. And last week, when NATO foreign ministers met, their final statement simply pointed to a rather vague pledge, all the way back from 2008, that simply said that Ukraine will someday join this 30-member military alliance. On Crux Decode, why is NATO pussyfooting on the question of Ukraine's NATO membership? Is there a feeling both in Europe and in the United States that any talk of Ukraine's membership would only further exacerbate tensions? Is the core of NATO leadership coming around to the view that Vladimir Putin needs to be offered a face-saver to end this war? NATO is fractured over how and when Ukraine should join this grouping. Big capitals, whether it is London, Paris, or Washington, do not want to provoke the Kremlin any further. They are aware of Vladimir Putin's hypersensitivity to NATO's eastward expansion. And most notably, NATO membership would legally require allies of this 30-member grouping to come to Ukraine's aid in case it is militarily attacked. Now, that is a situation that many allies would rather avoid. Since this war began, NATO has been breaching one no-go area after another, from imposing sanctions on Russia to providing billions and billions of military aid to Ukraine and even putting a price cap on Russian oil. But no one wants to touch with a barge pole the question of NATO granting membership to Ukraine. It was French President Emmanuel Macron last weekend who sparked an outcry when he said that the West must consider security guarantees for Russia if it were to return to the negotiating table. That is a gesture, that is a statement from Macron which enraged Kiev. It appeared to go against NATO's open-door policy. And behind the scenes, Ukrainian officials themselves have been facing annoyed colleagues who have been making their plea public for swift membership. Some very good friends of Ukraine are more afraid of a positive reply to Ukraine's bid for membership in NATO than of providing Ukraine with the most sophisticated weapons. That is what Dmytro Kuleba, Ukraine's foreign minister, said last week. Ukraine's leadership has argued that for all intents and purposes, it is already a member of this Western military alliance, and therefore it deserves a quick path to formal NATO membership. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, in fact, said that Ukraine would de facto allies. He announced his country's bid to join NATO back in September, where he wanted an accelerated procedure.
Ми довіряємо один одному, ми допомагаємо один одному, і ми захищаємо один одного. Це і є альянс. Де-факто. Сьогодні Україна подає заявку, щоб зробити це де-юре, за процедурою, яка відповідатиме нашому значенню для захисту всієї нашої спільноти у пришвидшеному порядку.
The Ukrainian leader's statement also caught many of Kiev's closest allies and partners by surprise. It also left several others grumbling. This overture threatened to derail a formula that Washington, London, and Paris had essentially settled on. Weapons now, membership talk later. It was an approach that they felt would deprive Moscow of a pretext to pull NATO directly into this conflict. In their statement last week, the ministers, the NATO foreign ministers, pledged to step up political as well as practical help for Ukraine, while at the same time avoiding any concrete plans for Kiev's future membership of NATO. Ultimately, though, few allies question Ukraine's long-term membership prospects. At least that's the theory. The divisions are really more of how and when the question of Kiev's membership will be addressed. A number of Eastern European allies, for example, have been arguing for a closer political relationship between Ukraine and NATO. They want a more concrete plan which sets the stage for membership. At the other end of the continent, France's Emmanuel Macron, he wants to take Moscow's perspectives into account as well. In fact, this is what he said, and I quote, "One of the essential points we must address, as President Vladimir Putin has always said, is the fear that NATO comes right up to Russia's doors and the deployment of weapons that could threaten Russia." That's what Macron told a French television channel, TF1, in an interview recently. Most other allies are essentially evading this subject. They're not rejecting Ukraine's NATO dreams, but at the same time, they're repeating a carefully crafted line about focusing on the current war. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, in fact, offered his 2 cents last week, and again I quote, "The most immediate and urgent task is to ensure that Ukraine prevails as a sovereign, independent, democratic nation in Europe," unquote. Now, analysts say the fault lines primarily lie between Western European capitals like Berlin and Paris, which see membership as an ultra-sensitive issue, one that they want to avoid at all costs at this very point of time. And then there are the Eastern capitals, which see Ukrainian accession as a goal that the alliance should begin working towards. Since this war began, that divide between the western part of Europe and the eastern part has only exacerbated. Some countries simply don't even want to have a conversation about this because they feel it might further harden Russia's response. Ukrainian officials do recognize that NATO membership is not imminent, it's not going to happen anytime in the next few months or years, but they still want some kind of an assurance, a gesture from the leaders of the alliance. The ideal scenario, of course, would be a simple sentence from NATO. "Okay, Ukraine, we've received your application, we're beginning the process of considering it." That in itself would be seen as a major milestone by the Ukrainians. Ukraine, in fact, formally adopted a constitutional amendment in 2019 committing to pursue NATO membership. Many feel that that amendment was the reason why Putin launched his special military operation earlier this year. But even though the country has pursued some reforms over the last few years, experts and government partners say there is more that Ukraine must do to integrate with the rest of NATO and with the rest of Europe. Ultimately, the bigger question is not so much Ukraine joining NATO, that of course is almost like a foregone conclusion, it's just a question of time. What the Russian special military operation has done is push neutral countries like Finland and Sweden firmly into the NATO embrace.